My notes on my first session with Don Juan are dated June 23, 1961. That was the occasion when the teachings began. I had seen him several times previously in the capacity of an observer only. At every opportunity, I had asked him to teach me about peyote. He ignored my request every time, but he never completely dismissed the subject, and I interpreted his hesitancy as a possibility that he might be inclined to talk about his knowledge with more coaxing. In this particular session, he made it obvious to me that he might consider my request, provided I possessed clarity of mind and purpose in reference to what I had asked him. It was impossible for me to fulfill such a condition, for I had asked him to teach me about peyote only as a means of establishing a link of communication with him. I thought his familiarity with the subject might predispose him to be more open and willing to talk, thus allowing me an entrance into his knowledge on the properties of plants. He had interpreted my request literally, however, and was concerned about my purpose in wishing to learn about peyote. Friday, June 23, 1961. Would you teach me about peyote, Don Juan? Why would you like to undertake such learning? I really would like to know about it. Is not just to want to know a good reason? No. You must search in your heart and find out why a young man like you wants to undertake such a task of learning. Why did you learn about it yourself, Don Juan? Why do you ask that? Maybe we both have the same reasons. I doubt that. I am an Indian. We don't have the same paths. The only reason I have is that I want to learn about it, just to know. But I assure you, Don Juan, my intentions are not bad. I believe you. I've smoked you. I beg your pardon? It doesn't matter now. I know your intentions. Do you mean you saw through me? You could put it that way. Will you teach me then? No. Is it because I'm not an Indian? No. It's because you don't know your heart. What's important is that you know exactly why you want to involve yourself. Learning about mezcalito is a most serious act. If you were an Indian, your desire alone would be sufficient. Very few Indians have such a desire. Friday, June 23, 1961. As soon as I sat down, I bombarded Don Juan with questions. He didn't answer me, and made an impatient gesture with his hand, to be quiet. He seemed to be in a serious mood. I was thinking that you haven't changed at all in the time you've been trying to learn about plants, he said, in an accusing tone. He began reviewing in a loud voice all the changes of personality he'd recommended I should undertake. I told him that I had considered the matter very seriously and found that I couldn't possibly fulfill them, because each of them ran contrary to my core. He replied that to merely consider them wasn't enough, and that whatever he had said to me was not said just for fun. I again insisted that, although I had done very little in matters of adjusting my personal life to his ideas, I really wanted to learn the uses of plants. After a long, uneasy silence, I boldly asked him, "Would you teach me about peyote, Don Juan?" He said that my intentions alone were not enough, and that to know about peyote, he called it mezcalito for the first time, was a serious matter. It seemed that there was nothing else to say. In the early evening, however, he set up a test for me. He put forth a problem, without giving me any clues to its solution, to find a beneficial place or spot in the area right in front of his door, where we always sat to talk. A spot where I could allegedly feel perfectly happy and invigorated. During the course of the night, while I attempted to find the spot by rolling on the ground, I twice detected a change of coloration on the uniformly dark dirt floor of the designated area. The problem exhausted me,
and I fell asleep on one of the places where I detected the change in color. In the morning, Don Juan woke me up and announced that I had had a very successful experience. Not only had I found the beneficial spot I was looking for, but I had also found its opposite, an enemy or negative spot, and the colors associated with both.
Sunday, June 25th, 1961. I stayed with Don Juan all afternoon on Friday. I was going to leave about 7 p.m. We were sitting on the porch in front of his house, and I decided to ask him once more about the teaching. It was almost a routine question, and I expected him to refuse again. I asked him if there was a way in which he could accept just my desire to learn, as if I were an Indian. He took a long time to answer. I was compelled to stay, because he seemed to be trying to decide something. Finally, he told me that there was a way, and proceeded to delineate a problem. He pointed out that I was very tired sitting on the floor, and that the proper thing to do was to find a spot, or sitio, on the floor where I could sit without fatigue. I had been sitting with my knees up against my chest and my arms locked around my calves. When he said I was tired, I realized that my back ached and that I was quite exhausted. I waited for him to explain what he meant by a spot, but he made no overt attempt to elucidate the point. I thought that perhaps he meant that I should change positions, so I got up and sat closer to him. He protested my movement and clearly emphasized that a spot meant a place where a man could feel naturally happy and strong. He patted the place where he sat and said it was his own spot, adding that he had posed a riddle I had to solve by myself without any further deliberation. What he had posed as a problem to be solved was certainly a riddle. I had no idea how to begin or even what he had in mind. Several times I asked for a clue or at least a hint as to how to proceed in locating a point where I felt happy and strong. I insisted and argued that I had no idea what he really meant because I couldn't conceive the problem. He suggested I walk around the porch until I found the spot. I got up and began to pace the floor. I felt silly and sat down in front of him. He became very annoyed with me and accused me of not listening, saying that perhaps I didn't want to learn. After a while, he calmed down and explained to me that not every place was good to sit or be on, and that within the confines of the porch, there was one spot that was unique, a spot where I could be at my very best. It was my task to distinguish it from all the other places. The general pattern was that I had to feel all the possible spots that were accessible until I could determine without a doubt which was the right one. I argued that although the porch was not too large, 12 by 8 feet, the number of possible spots was overwhelming, and it would take me a very long time to check all of them, and that since he had not specified the size of the spot, the possibilities might be infinite. My arguments were futile. He got up and very sternly warned me that it might take me days to figure it out, but that if I didn't solve the problem, I might as well leave, because he would have nothing to say to me. He emphasized that he knew where my spot was, and that therefore I could not lie to him. He said this was the only way he could accept my desire to learn about Mezcalito as a valid reason. He added that nothing in his world was a gift, that whatever there was to learn had to be learned the hard way. He went around the house to the chaparral to urinate. He returned directly into his house through the back. I thought the assignment to find the alleged spot of happiness was his own way of dismissing me, but I got up and started to pace back and forth. The sky was clear. I could see everything on and near the porch. I must have paced for an hour or more, but nothing happened to reveal the location of the spot. I got tired of walking and sat down. After a few minutes, I sat somewhere else, and then at another place, until I had covered the whole floor in a semi-systematic fashion. I deliberately tried to feel differences between places, but I lacked the criteria for differentiation. I felt I was wasting my time, but I stayed. My rationalization was that I had come a long way just to see Don Juan, and I really had nothing else to do. I lay down on my back and put my hands under my head like a pillow. Then I rolled over and lay on my stomach for a while. I repeated this rolling process over the entire floor. For the first time, I thought I had stumbled upon a vague criterion. I felt warmer when I lay on my back. I rolled again, this time in the opposite direction, and again covered the length of the floor, lying face down on all the places where I had lain face up during my first rolling tour. I experienced the same warm and cold sensations, depending on my position, but there was no difference between spots. Then an idea occurred to me, which I thought to be brilliant. Don Juan's spot. I sat there, and then lay, face down at first, and later on my back. But the place was just like all the others. I stood up. I had had enough. I wanted to say goodbye to Don Juan, but I was embarrassed to wake him up. I looked at my watch. It was 2:00 in the morning. I had been rolling for 6 hours. At that moment, Don Juan came out and went around the house to the chaparral. He came back and stood at the door. I felt utterly dejected, and I wanted to say something nasty to him and leave. But I realized that it wasn't his fault, that it was my own choice to go through all that nonsense. I told him I'd failed. I'd been rolling on his floor like an idiot all night and still couldn't make any sense of his riddle. He laughed and said that it didn't surprise him because I had not proceeded correctly. I hadn't been using my eyes. That was true, yet I was very sure he'd said to feel the difference. I brought that point up, but he argued that one can feel with the eyes, when the eyes are not looking right into things. As far as I was concerned, he said, I had no other means to solve this problem but to use all I had, my eyes. He went inside. I was certain that he'd been watching me. I thought there was no other way for him to know that I hadn't been using my eyes. I began to roll again, because that was the most comfortable procedure. This time, however, I rested my chin on my hands and looked at every detail. After an interval, the darkness around me changed. When I focused on the point directly in front of me, the whole peripheral area of my field of vision became brilliantly colored with a homogeneous greenish yellow. The effect was startling. I kept my eyes fixed on the point in front of me and began to crawl sideways on my stomach, 1 foot at a time. Suddenly, at a point near the middle of the floor, I became aware of another change in hue. At a place to my right, still in the periphery of my field of vision, the greenish yellow became intensely purple. I concentrated my attention on it. The purple faded into a pale but still brilliant color, which remained steady for the time I kept my attention on it. I marked the place with my jacket and called Don Juan. He came out to the porch. I was truly excited. I'd actually seen the change in hues. He seemed unimpressed, but told me to sit on the spot and report to him what kind of feeling I had. I sat down and then lay on my back. He stood by me and asked me repeatedly how I felt, but I didn't feel anything different. For about 15 minutes, I tried to feel or to see a difference, while Don Juan stood by me patiently. I felt disgusted. I had a metallic taste in my mouth. Suddenly, I developed a headache. I was about to get sick. The thought of my nonsensical endeavors irritated me to a point of fury. I got up. Don Juan must have noticed my profound frustration. He didn't laugh, but very seriously stated that I had to be inflexible with myself if I wanted to learn. Only 2 choices were open to me, he said. Either to quit and go home, in which case I would never learn, or to solve the riddle. He went inside again. I wanted to leave immediately, but I was too tired to drive. Besides, perceiving the hues had been so startling that I was sure it was a criterion of some sort, and perhaps there were other changes to be detected. Anyway, it was too late to leave, so I sat down, stretched my legs back, and began all over again. During this round, I moved rapidly through each place, passing Don Juan's spot to the end of the floor, and then turned around to cover the outer edge. When I reached the center, I realized that another change in coloration was taking place, again on the edge of my field of vision. The uniform chartreuse I was seeing all over the area turned, at one spot to my right, into a sharp verdigris. It remained for a moment and then abruptly metamorphosed into another steady hue, different from the other one I had detected earlier. I took off one of my shoes and marked the point, and kept on rolling until I had covered the floor in all possible directions. No other change of coloration took place. I came back to the point marked with my shoe and examined it. It was located 5 to 6 feet away from the spot marked by my jacket in a southeasterly direction. There was a large rock next to it. I lay down there for quite some time trying to find clues, looking at every detail, but I didn't feel anything different. I decided to try the other spot. I quickly pivoted on my knees and was about to lie down on my jacket when I felt an unusual apprehension. It was more like a physical sensation of something actually pushing on my stomach. I jumped up and retreated in one movement. The hair on my neck pricked up. My legs had arched slightly, my trunk was bent forward, and my arms stuck out in front of me rigidly with my fingers contracted like a claw. I took notice of my strange posture, and my fright increased. I walked back involuntarily and sat down on the rock next to my shoe. From the rock, I slumped to the floor. I tried to figure out what had happened to cause me such a fright. I thought it must have been the fatigue I was experiencing. It was nearly daytime. I felt silly and embarrassed, yet I had no way to explain what had frightened me, nor had I figured out what Don Juan wanted. I decided to give it one last try. I got up and slowly approached the place marked by my jacket, and again I felt the same apprehension. This time, I made a strong effort to control myself. I sat down and then knelt in order to lie face down. But I could not lie in spite of my will. I put my hands on the floor in front of me. My breathing accelerated. My stomach was upset. I had a clear sensation of panic and fought not to run away. I thought Don Juan was perhaps watching me. Slowly, I crawled back to the other spot and propped my back against the rock. I wanted to rest for a while to organize my thoughts, but I fell asleep. I heard Don Juan talking and laughing above my head. I woke up. "You have found the spot," he said. I didn't understand him at first, but he assured me again that the place where I had fallen asleep was the spot in question. He again asked me how I felt lying there. I told him I really didn't notice any difference. He asked me to compare my feelings at that moment with what I had felt while lying on the other spot. For the first time, it occurred to me that I couldn't possibly explain my apprehension of the preceding night. He urged me in a kind of challenging way to sit on the other spot. For some inexplicable reason, I was actually afraid of the other place and didn't sit on it. He asserted that only a fool could fail to see the difference. I asked him if each of the two spots had a special name. He said that the good one was called the sitio, and the bad one the enemy. He said these two places were the key to a man's well-being, especially for a man who was pursuing knowledge. The sheer act of sitting on one spot created superior strength. On the other hand, the enemy weakened a man and could even cause his death. He said I had replenished my energy, which I had spent lavishly the night before, by taking a nap on my spot. He also said that the colors I had seen in association with each specific spot had the same overall effect, either of giving strength or of curtailing it. I asked him if there were other spots for me like the two I had found, and how I should go about finding them. He said that many places in the world would be comparable to those two, and that the best way to find them was by detecting their respective colors. It wasn't clear to me whether or not I had solved the problem, and in fact, I wasn't even convinced that there had been a problem. I couldn't avoid feeling that the whole experience was forced and arbitrary. I was certain that Don Juan had watched me all night, and then proceeded to humor me by saying that wherever I had fallen asleep was the place I was looking for. Yet I failed to see a logical reason for such an act, and when he challenged me to sit on the other spot, I couldn't do it. There was a strange cleavage between my pragmatic experience of fearing the other spot and my rational deliberations about the total event. Don Juan, on the other hand, was very sure I had succeeded, and acting in accordance with my success, let me know he was going to teach me about peyote. "You asked me to teach you about Mescalito," he said. "I wanted to find out if you had enough backbone to meet him face to face. Mescalito is not something to make fun of. You must have command over your resources. Now I know I can take your desire alone as a good reason to learn." "You really are going to teach me about peyote?" "I prefer to call him Mescalito. Do the same." "When are you going to start?" "It's not so simple as that. You must be ready first." "I think I'm ready." "This is not a joke. You must wait until there is no doubt, and then you will meet him." "Do I have to prepare myself?" "No. You simply have to wait. You may give up the whole idea after a while. You get tired easily. Last night, you were ready to quit as soon as it got difficult. Mescalito requires a very serious intent."
Saturday, June 24th, 1961. We went into the desert chaparral in the early morning. As we walked, Don Juan explained to me that finding a beneficial or an enemy spot was an important need for a man in the wilderness. I wanted to steer the conversation to the topic of peyote, but he flatly refused to talk about it. He warned me that there should be no mention of it unless he himself brought up the subject. We sat down to rest in the shade of some tall bushes in an area of thick vegetation. The desert chaparral around us was not quite dry yet. It was a warm day, and the flies kept on pestering me, but they didn't seem to bother Don Juan. I wondered whether he was just ignoring them, but then I noticed that they weren't landing on his face at all. "Sometimes it's necessary to find a beneficial spot quickly, out in the open," Don Juan went on. "Or maybe it is necessary to determine quickly whether or not the spot where one is about to rest is a bad one. One time, we sat to rest by some hill, and you got very angry and upset. That spot was your enemy. A little crow gave you a warning, remember?" I remembered that he had made a point of telling me to avoid that area in the future. I also remembered that I had become angry because he hadn't let me laugh. "I thought that the crow that flew overhead was an omen for me alone," he said. "I would never have suspected that the crows were friendly towards you, too." "What are you talking about?" "The crow was an omen," he went on. "If you knew about crows, you would have avoided the place like the plague. Crows aren't always available to give warning, though, and you must learn to find, by yourself, a proper place to camp or to rest." After a long pause, Don Juan suddenly turned to me and said that in order to find the proper place to rest, all I had to do was to cross my eyes. He gave me a knowing look and in a confidential tone told me that I had done precisely that when I was rolling on his porch, and thus I had been capable of finding 2 spots and their colors. He let me know that he was impressed by my accomplishment. "I really don't know what I did," I said. "You crossed your eyes," he said emphatically. "That's the technique. You must have done that, although you don't remember it." Don Juan then described the technique, which he said took years to perfect, and which consisted of gradually forcing the eyes to see separately the same image. The lack of image conversion entailed a double perception of the world. This double perception, according to Don Juan, allowed one the opportunity of judging changes in the surroundings, which the eyes were ordinarily incapable of perceiving. Don Juan coaxed me to try it. He assured me that it wasn't injurious to the sight. He said that I should begin by looking in short glances, almost with the corners of my eyes. He pointed to a large bush and showed me how. I had a strange feeling, seeing Don Juan's eyes taking incredibly fast glances at the bush. His eyes reminded me of those of a shifty animal that can't look straight. We walked for perhaps an hour while I tried not to focus my sight on anything. Then Don Juan asked me to start separating the images perceived by each of my eyes. After another hour or so, I got a terrible headache and had to stop. "Do you think you could find, by yourself, a proper place for us to rest?" he asked. I had no idea what the criterion for a proper place was. He patiently explained that looking in short glances allowed the eyes to pick out unusual sights. "Such as what?" I asked. "They aren't sights proper," he said. "They're more like feelings. If you look at a bush, or a tree, or a rock, where you may like to rest, your eyes can make you feel whether or not that's the best resting place." I again urged him to describe what those feelings were, but he either could not describe them, or he simply didn't want to. He said that I should practice by picking out a place, and then he would tell me whether or not my eyes were working. At one moment, I caught sight of what I thought was a pebble, which reflected light. I couldn't see it if I focused my eyes on it, but if I swept the area with fast glances, I could detect a sort of faint glitter. I pointed out the place to Don Juan. It was in the middle of an open, unshaded, flat area, devoid of thick bushes. He laughed uproariously, and then asked me why I had picked that specific spot. I explained that I was seeing a glitter. "I don't care what you see," he said. "You could be seeing an elephant. How you feel is the important issue." I didn't feel anything at all. He gave me a mysterious look and said that he wished he could oblige me and sit down to rest with me there, but he was going to sit somewhere else while I tested my choice. I sat down while he looked at me curiously from a distance of 30 or 40 feet away. After a few minutes, he began to laugh loudly. Somehow, his laughter made me nervous. It put me on edge. I felt he was making fun of me, and I got angry. I began to question my motives for being there. There was definitely something wrong in the way my total endeavor with Don Juan was proceeding. I felt that I was just a pawn in his clutches. Suddenly, Don Juan charged at me at full speed and pulled me by the arm, dragging me bodily for 10 or 12 feet. He helped me to stand up and wiped some perspiration from his forehead. I noticed then that he had exerted himself to his limit. He patted me on the back and said that I had picked the wrong place, and that he had to rescue me in a real hurry because he saw that the spot where I was sitting was about to take over my entire feelings. I laughed. The image of Don Juan charging at me was very funny. He had actually run like a young man. His feet moved as if he were grabbing the soft, reddish dirt of the desert in order to catapult himself over me. I'd seen him laughing at me, and then in a matter of seconds, he was dragging me by the arm. After a while, he urged me to continue looking for a proper place to rest. We kept on walking, but I didn't detect or feel anything at all. Perhaps, if I had been more relaxed, I would have noticed or felt something. I had ceased, however, to be angry with him. Finally, he pointed to some rocks, and we came to a halt. "Don't feel disappointed," Don Juan said. "It takes a long time to train the eyes properly." I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to be disappointed about something I didn't understand at all. Yet I had to admit that 3 times already, since I'd begun to visit Don Juan, I'd become very angry, and had been agitated to the point of being nearly ill while sitting on places that he called bad. "The trick is to feel with your eyes," he said. "Your problem now is that you don't know what to feel. It'll come to you, though, with practice." "Perhaps you should tell me, Don Juan, what I'm supposed to feel." "That's impossible." "Why?" "No one can tell you what you're supposed to feel. It isn't heat, or light, or glare, or color. It's something else." "Can't you describe it?" "No. All I can do is give you the technique. Once you learn to separate the images and see 2 of everything, you must focus your attention in the area between the 2 images. Any change worthy of notice would take place there, in that area." "What kind of changes are they?" "That's not important. The feeling that you get is what counts. Every man is different. You saw glitter today, but that didn't mean anything because the feeling was missing. I can't tell you how to feel. You must learn that yourself." We rested in silence for some time. Don Juan covered his face with his hat and remained motionless, as if he were asleep. I became absorbed in writing my notes, until he made a sudden movement that made me jolt. He sat up abruptly and faced me, frowning. "You have a knack for hunting," he said, "and that's what you should learn. Hunting. We're not going to talk about plants anymore." He puffed out his jaw for an instant, then candidly added, "I don't think we ever have, anyway. Have we?" and laughed. We spent the rest of the day walking in every direction while he gave me an unbelievably detailed explanation about rattlesnakes. The way they nest, the way they move around, their seasonal habits, their quirks of behavior. Then he proceeded to corroborate each of the points he had made, and finally he caught and killed a large snake, he cut its head off, cleaned its viscera, skinned it, and roasted the meat. His movements had such a grace and skill that it was a sheer pleasure just to be around him. I'd listened to him and watched him, spellbound. My concentration had been so complete that the rest of the world had practically vanished for me. Eating the snake was a hard re-entry into the world of ordinary affairs. I felt nauseated when I began to chew a bite of snake meat. It was an ill-founded queasiness, as the meat was delicious, but my stomach seemed to be rather an independent unit. I could hardly swallow at all. I thought Don Juan would have a heart attack from laughing so hard. Afterwards, we sat down for a leisurely rest in the shade of some rocks. I began to work on my notes, and the quantity of them made me realize that he had given me an astonishing amount of information about rattlesnakes. "Your hunter's spirit has returned to you," Don Juan said suddenly and with a serious face. "Now you're hooked." "I beg your pardon?" I wanted him to elaborate on his statement that I was hooked, but he only laughed and repeated it. "How am I hooked?" I insisted. "Hunters will always hunt," he said. "I am a hunter myself." "Do you mean you hunt for a living?" "I hunt in order to live. I can live off the land, anywhere." He indicated the total surroundings with his head. "To be a hunter means that one knows a great deal," he went on. "It means that one can see the world in different ways. In order to be a hunter, one must be in perfect balance with everything else. Otherwise, hunting would become a meaningless chore. For instance, today, we took a little snake. I had to apologize to her for cutting her life off so suddenly and so definitely. I did what I did, knowing that my own life will also be cut off someday, in very much the same fashion, suddenly and definitely. So, all in all, we and the snakes are on a par. One of them fed us today."
"I'd never conceived a balance of that kind when I used to hunt," I said.
"That's not true. You didn't just kill animals. You and your family all ate the game."
His statements carried the conviction of someone who had been there. He was, of course, right. There had been times when I had provided the incidental wild meat for my family. After a moment's hesitation, I asked, "How did you know that?"
"There are certain things that I just know," he said. "I can't tell you how, though."
I told him that my aunts and uncles would very seriously call all the birds I would bag pheasants. Don Juan said that he could easily imagine them calling a sparrow a tiny pheasant, and added a comical rendition of how they would chew it. The extraordinary movements of his jaw gave me the feeling that he was actually chewing a whole bird, bones and all.
"I really think that you have a touch for hunting," he said, staring at me. "And we've been barking up the wrong tree. Perhaps you'll be willing to change your way of life in order to become a hunter."
He reminded me that I had found out with just a little exertion on my part that in the world there were good and bad spots for me. He added that I had also found out the specific colors associated with them.
"That means that you have a knack for hunting," he declared. "Not everyone who tried would find their colors and their spots at the same time."
To be a hunter sounded very nice and romantic, but it was an absurdity to me, since I didn't particularly care to hunt.
"You don't have to care to hunt, or to like it," he replied to my complaint. "You have a natural inclination. I think the best hunters never like hunting. They do it well, that's all."
I had the feeling Don Juan was capable of arguing his way out of anything, and yet he maintained that he didn't like to talk at all.
"It's like what I've told you about hunters," he said. "I don't necessarily like to talk. I just have a knack for it, and I do it well, that's all."
I found his mental agility truly funny.
"Hunters must be exceptionally tight individuals," he continued. "A hunter leaves very little to chance. I've been trying all along to convince you that you must learn to live in a different way. So far, I haven't succeeded. There was nothing you could have grabbed onto. Now, it's different. I've brought back your old hunter's spirit. Perhaps through it, you will change."
I protested that I didn't want to become a hunter. I reminded him that in the beginning I just wanted him to tell me about medicinal plants, but he had made me stray so far away from my original purpose that I couldn't clearly recall anymore whether or not I had really wanted to learn about plants.
"Good," he said, "really good. If you don't have such a clear picture of what you want, you may become more humble. Let's put it this way. For your purposes, it doesn't really matter whether you learn about plants or about hunting. You've told me that yourself. You're interested in anything that anyone can tell you. True?"
I had said that to him in trying to define the scope of anthropology and in order to draft him as my informant. Don Juan chuckled, obviously aware of his control over the situation.
"I am a hunter," he said, as if he were reading my thoughts. "I leave very little to chance. Perhaps I should explain to you that I learned to be a hunter. I haven't always lived the way I do now. At one point in my life, I had to change. Now, I'm pointing the direction to you. I'm guiding you. I know what I'm talking about. Someone taught me all this. I didn't figure it out for myself.
Do you mean that you had a teacher, Don Juan?
Let's say that someone taught me to hunt the way I want to teach you now, he said, and quickly changed the topic. I think that once upon a time hunting was one of the greatest acts a man could perform, he said. All hunters were powerful men. In fact, a hunter had to be powerful to begin with in order to withstand the rigors of that life. Suddenly, I became curious. Was he referring to a time perhaps prior to the conquest? I began to probe him. When was the time you were talking about? Once upon a time. When? What does once upon a time mean? It means once upon a time. Or maybe it means now, today. It doesn't matter. At one time, everybody knew that a hunter was the best of men. Now not everyone knows that. But there are a sufficient number of people who do. I know it. Someday, you will. See what I mean? Do the Yaqui Indians feel that way about hunters? That's what I want to know. Not necessarily. Do the Pima Indians? Not all of them, but some. I named various neighboring groups. I wanted to commit him to a statement that hunting was a shared belief and practice of some specific people, but he avoided answering me directly, so I changed the subject. Why are you doing all this for me, Don Juan? I asked. He took off his hat and scratched his temples in feigned bafflement. I'm having a gesture with you, he said softly. Other people have had a similar gesture with you. Someday you yourself will have the same gesture with others. Let's say that it's my turn. One day I found out that if I wanted to be a hunter worthy of self-respect, I had to change my way of life. I used to whine and complain a great deal. I had good reasons to feel shortchanged. I'm an Indian, and Indians are treated like dogs. There was nothing I could do to remedy that, so all I was left with was my sorrow. But then my good fortune spared me, and someone taught me to hunt, and I realized that the way I lived wasn't worth living, so I changed it. But I'm happy with my life, Don Juan. Why should I have to change it? He began to sing a Mexican song very softly, and then hummed the tune. His head bobbed up and down as he followed the beat of the song. Do you think that you and I are equals? He asked in a sharp voice. His question caught me off guard. I experienced a peculiar buzzing in my ears, as though he had actually shouted his words, which he hadn't done. However, there had been a metallic sound in his voice that was reverberating in my ears. I scratched the inside of my left ear with the small finger of my left hand. My ears itched all the time, and I had developed a rhythmical nervous way of rubbing the inside of them with the small finger of either hand. The movement was more properly a shake of my whole arm. Don Juan watched my movements with apparent fascination. Well, are we equals? He asked. Of course we're equals, I said. I was, naturally, being condescending. I felt very warm towards him, even though at times I didn't know what to do with him. Yet I still held in the back of my mind, although I would never voice it, the belief that I, being a university student, a man of the sophisticated Western world, was superior to an Indian. No, he said calmly. We are not. Why, certainly we are, I protested. No, he said in a soft voice. We're not equals. I am a hunter and a warrior, and you are a pimp. My mouth fell open. I couldn't believe that Don Juan had actually said that. I dropped my notebook and stared at him dumbfoundedly, and then, of course, I became furious. He looked at me with calm and collected eyes. I avoided his gaze, and then he began to talk. He enunciated his words clearly. They poured out smoothly and deadly. He said that I was pimping for someone else, that I wasn't fighting my own battles, but the battles of some unknown people, that I didn't want to learn about plants or about hunting or about anything, and that his world of precise acts and feelings and decisions was infinitely more effective than the blundering idiocy I called my life. After he finished talking, I was numb. He'd spoken without belligerence or conceit, but with such power, and yet such calmness, that I wasn't even angry anymore. We remained silent. I felt embarrassed, and couldn't think of anything appropriate to say. I waited for him to break the silence. Hours went by. Don Juan became motionless by degrees, until his body had acquired a strange, almost frightening rigidity. His silhouette became difficult to make out as it got dark, and finally, when it was pitch black around us, he seemed to have merged into the blackness of the stones. His state of motionlessness was so total that it was as if he didn't exist any longer. It was midnight when I finally realized that he could and would stay motionless there in that wilderness, in those rocks. Perhaps forever, if he had to. His world of precise acts and feelings and decisions was indeed superior. I quietly touched his arms, and tears flooded me. 7. Being inaccessible. Thursday, June 29th, 1961. Again, Don Juan, as he had done every day for nearly a week, held me spellbound with his knowledge of specific details about the behavior of game. He first explained and then corroborated a number of hunting tactics based on what he called the quirks of quails. I became so utterly involved in his explanations that a whole day went by, and I hadn't noticed the passage of time. I even forgot to eat lunch. Don Juan made joking remarks that it was quite unusual for me to miss a meal. By the end of the day, he had caught 5 quail in a most ingenious trap, which he had taught me to assemble and set up. 2 are enough for us, he said, and let 3 of them loose. He then taught me how to roast quail. I had wanted to cut some shrubs and make a barbecue pit, the way my grandfather used to make it, lined with green branches and leaves and sealed with dirt. But Don Juan said that there was no need to injure the shrubs, since we had already injured the quail. After we finished eating, we walked very leisurely towards a rocky area. We sat on a sandstone hillside, and I said jokingly that if he would have left the matter up to me, I would have cooked all 5 of the quail, and that my barbecue would have tasted much better than his roast. "No doubt," he said. "But if you would have done all that, we might have never left this place in one piece." "What do you mean?" I asked. "What would have prevented us?" "The shrubs, the quail, everything around would have pitched in." "I never know when you're talking seriously," I said. He made a gesture of feigned impatience and smacked his lips. "You have a weird notion of what it means to talk seriously," he said. "I laugh a great deal because I like to laugh, yet everything I say is deadly serious, even if you don't understand it. Why should the world be only as you think it is? Who gave you the authority to say so?" "There's no proof that the world is otherwise," I said. It was getting dark. I was wondering if it was time to go back to his house, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry, and I was enjoying myself. The wind was cold. Suddenly, he stood up and told me that we had to climb to the hilltop and stand up on an area clear of shrubs. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I'm your friend, and I'll see that nothing bad happens to you." "What do you mean?" I asked, alarmed. Don Juan had the most insidious facility to shift me from sheer enjoyment to sheer fright. "The world is very strange at this time of the day," he said. "That's what I mean. No matter what you see, don't be afraid." "What am I going to see?" "I don't know yet," he said, peering into the distance towards the south. He didn't seem to be worried. I also kept on looking in the same direction. Suddenly, he perked up and pointed with his left hand toward a dark area in the desert shrubbery. "There it is," he said, as if he had been waiting for something which had suddenly appeared. "What is it?" I asked. "There it is," he repeated. "Look! Look!" I didn't see anything, just the shrubs. "It's here now," he said with great urgency in his voice. "It is here." A sudden gust of wind hit me at that instant and made my eyes burn. I stared towards the area in question. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. "I can't see a thing," I said. "You just felt it," he replied. "Right now. It got into your eyes and kept you from seeing." "What are you talking about?" "I've deliberately brought you to a hilltop," he said. "We are very noticeable here, and something is coming to us." "What, the wind?" "Not just the wind," he said sternly. "It may seem to be wind to you, because wind is all you know." I strained my eyes, staring into the desert shrubs. Don Juan stood silently by me for a moment, and then walked into the nearby chaparral and began to tear some big branches from the surrounding shrubs. He gathered 8 of them and made a bundle. He ordered me to do the same and to apologize to the plants in a loud voice for mutilating them. When we had 2 bundles, he made me run with them to the hilltop and lie down on my back between 2 large rocks. With tremendous speed, he arranged the branches of my bundle to cover my entire body. Then he covered himself in the same manner and whispered through the leaves that I should watch how the so-called wind would cease to blow once we had become unnoticeable. At one moment, to my utter amazement, the wind actually ceased to blow, as Don Juan had predicted. It happened so gradually that I would have missed the change had I not been deliberately waiting for it. For a while, the wind had hissed through the leaves over my face, and then gradually it became quiet all around us. I whispered to Don Juan that the wind had stopped, and he whispered back that I shouldn't make any overt noise or movement because what I was calling the wind was not wind at all, but something that had a volition of its own and could actually recognize us. I laughed out of nervousness. In a muffled voice, Don Juan called my attention to the quietness around us and whispered that he was going to stand up, and I should follow him, putting the branches aside very gently with my left hand. We stood up at the same time. Don Juan stared for a moment into the distance toward the south, and then turned around abruptly and faced the west. "Sneaky. Really sneaky," he muttered, pointing to an area towards the southwest. "Look, look," he urged me. I stared with all the intensity I was capable of. I wanted to see whatever he was referring to, but I didn't notice anything at all. Or rather, I didn't notice anything I hadn't seen before. There were just shrubs, which seemed to be agitated by a soft wind. They rippled. "It's here," Don Juan said. At that moment, I felt a blast of air in my face. It seemed that the wind had actually begun to blow after we stood up. I couldn't believe it. There had to be a logical explanation for it. Don Juan chuckled softly and told me not to tax my brain trying to reason it out. "Let's go gather the shrubs once more," he said. "I hate to do this to these little plants, but we must stop you." He picked up the branches we had used to cover ourselves and piled small rocks and dirt over them. Then, repeating the same movements we had made before, each of us gathered 8 new branches. In the meantime, the wind kept on blowing ceaselessly. I could feel it ruffling the hair around my ears. Don Juan whispered that once he had covered me, I shouldn't make the slightest movement or sound. He very quickly put the branches over my body, and then he lay down and covered himself. We stayed in that position for about 20 minutes, and during that time, a most extraordinary phenomenon occurred. The wind again changed from a hard, continuous gust to a mild vibration. I held my breath, waiting for Don Juan's signal. At a given moment, he gently shoved off the branches. I did the same, and we stood up. The hilltop was very quiet. There was only a slight, soft vibration of leaves in the surrounding chaparral. Don Juan's eyes were fixedly staring at an area in the shrubs south of us. "There it is again!" he exclaimed in a loud voice. I involuntarily jumped, nearly losing my balance, and he ordered me in a loud, imperative voice to look. "What am I supposed to see?" I asked desperately. He said that it, the wind, or whatever, was like a cloud or a whorl that was quite a ways above the shrubs, twirling its way to the hilltop where we were. I saw a ripple forming on the bushes in the distance. "There it comes," Don Juan said in my ear. "Look, how it's searching for us." Right then, a strong, steady gust of wind hit my face, as it had hit it before. This time, however, my reaction was different. I was terrified. I hadn't seen what Don Juan had described, but I had seen a most eerie wave rippling the shrubs. I didn't want to succumb to my fear and deliberately sought any kind of suitable explanation. I said to myself that there must be continuous air currents in the area, and Don Juan, being thoroughly acquainted with the whole region, was not only aware of that, but was capable of mentally plotting their occurrence. All he had to do was to lie down, count, and wait for the wind to taper off, and once he stood up, he had only to wait again for its reoccurrence. Don Juan's voice shook me out of my mental deliberations. He was telling me that it was time to leave. I stalled. I wanted to make sure that the wind would taper off. "I didn't see anything, Don Juan," I said. "You noticed something unusual, though." "Perhaps you should tell me again what I was supposed to see?" "I've already told you," he said. "Something that hides in the wind and looks like a whorl, a cloud, a mist, a face that twirls around." Don Juan made a gesture with his hands to depict a horizontal and a vertical motion. "It moves in a specific direction," he went on. "It either tumbles or it twirls. A hunter must know all that in order to move correctly." I wanted to humor him, but he seemed to be trying so hard to make his point that I didn't dare. He looked at me for a moment, and I moved my eyes away. "To believe that the world is only as you think it is stupid," he said. "The world is a mysterious place, especially in the twilight." He pointed towards the wind with a movement of his chin. "This can follow us," he said. "It can make us tired, or it might even kill us." "That wind? At this time of the day, in the twilight, there is no wind. At this time, there is only power." We sat on the hilltop for an hour. The wind blew hard and constantly all that time. Friday, June 30th, 1961. In the late afternoon, after eating, Don Juan and I moved to the area in front of his door. I sat on my spot and began working on my notes. He lay down on his back, with his hands folded over his stomach. We had stayed around the house all day on account of the wind. Don Juan explained that we had disturbed the wind deliberately, and that it was better not to fool around with it. I had even had to sleep covered with branches. A sudden gust of wind made Don Juan get up in one incredibly agile jump. "Damn it," he said, "the wind is looking for you." "I can't buy that, Don Juan," I said, laughing. "I really can't." I wasn't being stubborn. I just found it impossible to endorse the idea that the wind had its own volition and was looking for me, or that it had actually spotted us and rushed to us on top of the hill. I said that the idea of a willful wind was a view of the world that was rather simplistic. "What is the wind, then?" he asked in a challenging tone. I patiently explained to him that masses of hot and cold air produced different pressures, and that the pressure made the masses of air move vertically and horizontally. It took me a long while to explain all the details of basic meteorology. "You mean that all there is to the wind is hot and cold air?" he asked in a tone of bafflement. "I'm afraid so," I said, and silently enjoyed my triumph. Don Juan seemed to be dumbfounded, but then he looked at me and began to laugh uproariously. "Your opinions are final opinions," he said with a note of sarcasm. "They are the last word, aren't they? For a hunter, however, your opinions are pure crap. It makes no difference whether the pressure is 1 or 2 or 10. If you would live out here in the wilderness, you would know that during the twilight, the wind becomes power. A hunter that is worth his salt knows that and acts accordingly." "How does he act?" "He uses the twilight and that power hidden in the wind." "How?" "If it's convenient to him, the hunter hides from the power by covering himself and remaining motionless until the twilight is gone and the power has sealed him into its protection." Don Juan made a gesture of enveloping something with his hands. "Its protection is like a—" He paused in search of a word, and I suggested cocoon. "That's right," he said. "The protection of the power seals you like in a cocoon. A hunter can stay out in the open and no puma or coyote or slimy bug could bother him. A mountain lion could come up to the hunter's nose and sniff him, and if the hunter doesn't move, the lion would leave. I can guarantee you that. If the hunter, on the other hand, wants to be noticed, all he has to do is to stand on a hilltop at the time of the twilight, and the power will nag him and seek him all night. Therefore, if a hunter wants to travel at night, or if he wants to be kept awake, he must make himself available to the wind. Therein lies the secret of great hunters, to be available and unavailable at the precise turn of the road." I felt a bit confused, and asked him to recapitulate his point. Don Juan very patiently explained that he had used the twilight and the wind to point out the crucial importance of the interplay between hiding and showing oneself. "You must learn to become deliberately available and unavailable," he said. "As your life goes now, you are unwittingly available at all times." I protested. My feeling was that my life was becoming increasingly more and more secretive. He said that I hadn't understood his point, and that to be unavailable didn't mean to hide or to be secretive, but to be inaccessible. "Let me put it another way," he proceeded patiently. "It makes no difference to hide if everyone knows that you're hiding. Your problems right now stem from that. When you're hiding, everyone knows that you're hiding, and when you're not, you're available for everyone to take a poke at you." I was beginning to feel threatened and hurriedly tried to defend myself. "Don't explain yourself," Don Juan said dryly. "There's no need. We're fools, all of us, and you can't be different. At one time in my life, I, like you, made myself available over and over again, until there was nothing of me left for anything except, perhaps, crying. And that I did, just like yourself." Don Juan sized me up for a moment, and then sighed loudly. "I was younger than you, though," he went on. "But one day, I had enough, and I changed. Let's say that one day, when I was becoming a hunter, I learned the secret of being available and unavailable." I told him that his point was bypassing me. I truly couldn't understand what he meant by being available. He had used the Spanish idioms ponerse al alcance and ponerse en el medio del camino, to put oneself within reach and to put oneself in the middle of a trafficked way. "You must take yourself away," he explained. "You must retrieve yourself from the middle of a trafficked way. Your whole being is there. Thus, it's of no use to hide. You would only imagine that you're hidden. Being in the middle of the road means that everyone passing by watches your comings and goings." His metaphor was interesting, but at the same time, it was also obscure. "You're talking in riddles," I said. He stared at me fixedly for a long moment, and then began to hum a tune. I straightened my back and sat attentively. I knew that when Don Juan hummed a Mexican tune, he was about to clobber me. "Hey," he said, smiling, and peered at me. "Whatever happened to your blonde friend? That girl you used to really like?" I must have looked at him like a confounded idiot. He laughed with great delight. I didn't know what to say. "You told me about her," he said reassuringly. But I didn't remember ever telling him about anybody, much less about a blonde girl. "I've never mentioned anything like that to you," I said. "Of course you have," he said, as if dismissing the argument. I wanted to protest, but he stopped me, saying that it didn't matter how he knew about her, that the important issue was that I had liked her. I sensed a surge of animosity towards him building up within myself. "Don't stall," Don Juan said dryly. "This is a time when you should cut off your feelings of importance. You once had a woman, a very dear woman, and then one day you lost her." I began to wonder if I had ever talked about her to Don Juan. I concluded that there had never been an opportunity, yet I might have. Every time he drove with me, we had always talked incessantly about everything. I didn't remember everything we had talked about because I couldn't take notes while driving. I felt somehow appeased by my conclusions. I told him that he was right. There had been a very important blonde girl in my life. "Why isn't she with you?" he asked. "She left." "Why?" "There were many reasons." "There were not so many reasons. There was only one. You made yourself too available." I earnestly wanted to know what he meant. He again had touched me. He seemed to be cognizant of the effect of his touch and puckered up his lips to hide a mischievous smile. "Everyone knew about you two," he said with unshaken conviction. Was it wrong? It was deadly wrong. She was a fine person. I expressed the sincere feeling that his fishing in the dark was odious to me, especially the fact that he always made his statements with the assurance of someone who had been at the scene and had seen it all. "But that's true," he said with a disarming candor. "I have seen it all. She was a fine person." I knew that it was meaningless to argue, but I was angry with him for touching that sore spot in my life, and I said that the girl in question was not such a fine person after all, that in my opinion she was rather weak. "So were you," he said calmly. "But that's not important. What counts is that you've looked for her everywhere. That makes her a special person in your world, and for a special person, one should have only fine words." I felt embarrassed. A great sadness had begun to engulf me. "What are you doing to me, Don Juan?" I asked. "You always succeed in making me sad. Why?" "You're now indulging in sentimentality," he said accusingly. What's the point of all this, Don Juan? Being inaccessible is the point, he declared. I brought up the memory of this person only as a means to show you directly what I couldn't show you with the wind. You lost her because you were accessible. You were always within her reach, and your life was a routine one. No, I said, you're wrong. My life was never a routine. It was, and it is a routine, he said dogmatically. It is an unusual routine, and that gives you the impression that it's not a routine, but I assure you, it is. I wanted to sulk and get lost in moroseness, but somehow his eyes made me feel restless. They seemed to push me on and on. The art of a hunter is to become inaccessible, he said. In the case of that blonde girl, it would have meant that you had to become a hunter and meet her sparingly. Not the way you did. You stayed with her day after day, until the only feeling that remained was boredom. True? I didn't answer. I felt I didn't have to. He was right. To be inaccessible means that you touch the world around you sparingly. You don't eat 5 quail. You eat 1. You don't damage the plants just to make a barbecue pit. You don't expose yourself to the power of the wind unless it is mandatory. You don't use and squeeze people until they have shriveled to nothing, especially the people you love. I have never used anyone, I said sincerely. But Don Juan maintained that I had, and thus I could bluntly state that I became tired and bored with people. To be unavailable means that you deliberately avoid exhausting yourself and others, he continued. It means that you're not hungry and desperate, like the poor bastard that feels he'll never eat again and devours all the food he can, all 5 quail. Don Juan was definitely hitting me below the belt. I laughed, and that seemed to please him. He touched my back lightly. A hunter knows he will lure game into his traps over and over again, so he doesn't worry. To worry is to become accessible, unwittingly accessible. And once you worry, you cling to anything out of desperation. And once you cling, you are bound to get exhausted, or to exhaust whoever or whatever you're clinging to. I told him that in my day-to-day life it was inconceivable to be inaccessible. My point was that in order to function, I had to be within reach of everyone that had something to do with me. I've told you already that to be inaccessible doesn't mean to hide or to be secretive, he said calmly. It doesn't mean that you can't deal with people either. A hunter uses his world sparingly and with tenderness, regardless of whether the world might be things or plants or animal or people or power. A hunter deals intimately with his world, and yet he is inaccessible to that same world. That's a contradiction, I said. He can't be inaccessible if he is there in his world, hour after hour, day after day. You didn't understand, Don Juan said patiently. He is inaccessible because he's not squeezing his world out of shape. He taps it lightly, stays for as long as he needs to, and then swiftly moves away, leaving hardly a mark. 8. Disrupting the routines of life. Sunday, July 16th, 1961. We spent all morning watching some rodents that looked like fat squirrels. Don Juan called them water rats. He pointed out that they were very fast and getting out of danger. But after they had outrun any predator, they had the terrible habit of stopping or even climbing a rock to stand on their hind legs to look around and groom themselves. They have very good eyes, Don Juan said. You must move only when they are on the run. Therefore, you must learn to predict when and where they will stop, so you would also stop at the same time. I became engrossed in observing them, and I had what would have been a field day for hunters, as I spotted so many of them. And finally, I could predict their movements almost every time. Don Juan then showed me how to make traps to catch them. He explained that a hunter had to take time to observe their eating or their nesting places in order to determine where to locate his traps. He would then set them during the night, and all he had to do the next day was to scare them off so they would scatter away into his catching devices. We gathered some sticks and proceeded to build the hunting contraptions. I had mine almost finished and was excitedly wondering whether or not it would work, when suddenly Don Juan stopped and looked at his left wrist, as if he were checking a watch which he had never had, and said that according to his timepiece, it was lunchtime. I was holding a long stick which I was trying to make into a hoop by bending it in a circle. I automatically put it down with the rest of my hunting paraphernalia. Don Juan looked at me with an expression of curiosity. Then he made the wailing sound of a factory siren at lunchtime. I laughed. His siren sound was perfect. I walked toward him and noticed that he was staring at me. He shook his head from side to side. "I'll be damned," he said. "What's wrong?" I asked. He again made the long wailing sound of a factory whistle. "Lunch is over," he said. "Go back to work." I felt confused for an instant, but then I had thought that he was joking, perhaps because we really had nothing to make lunch with. I had been so engrossed with the rodents that I had forgotten we had no provisions. I picked up the stick again and tried to bend it. After a moment, Don Juan again blew his whistle. "Time to go home," he said. He examined his imaginary watch and then looked at me and winked. "It's 5 o'clock," he said with an air of someone revealing a secret. I thought that he had suddenly become fed up with hunting and was calling the whole thing off. I simply put everything down and began to get ready to leave. I didn't look at him. I presumed that he also was preparing his gear. When I was through, I looked up and saw him sitting cross-legged a few feet away. "I'm through," I said. "We can go any time." He got up and climbed a rock. He stood there, 5 or 6 feet above the ground, looking at me. He put his hands on either side of his mouth and made a very prolonged and piercing sound. It was like a magnified factory siren. He turned around in a complete circle, making the wailing sound. "What are you doing, Don Juan?" I asked. He said that he was giving the signal for the whole world to go home. I was completely baffled. I couldn't figure out whether he was joking or whether he had simply flipped his lid. I watched him intently and tried to relate what he was doing to something he may have said before. We'd hardly talked at all during the morning, and I couldn't remember anything of importance. Don Juan was still standing on top of the rock. He looked at me, smiled, and winked again. I suddenly became alarmed. Don Juan put his hands on both sides of his mouth and let out another long whistle-like sound. He said that it was 8 o'clock in the morning, and that I had to set up my gear again because we had a whole day ahead of us. I was completely confused by then. In a matter of minutes, my fear mounted to an irresistible desire to run away from the scene. I thought Don Juan was crazy. I was about to flee when he slid down from the rock and came to me, smiling. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" he asked. I told him that he was frightening me out of my wits with his unexpected behavior. He said that we were even. I didn't understand what he meant. I was deeply preoccupied with the thought that his acts seemed thoroughly insane. He explained that he had deliberately tried to scare me out of my wits with the heaviness of his unexpected behavior, because I myself was driving him up the walls with the heaviness of my expected behavior. He added that my routines were as insane as his blowing his whistle. I was shocked and asserted that I didn't really have any routines. I told him that I believed my life was in fact a mess because of my lack of healthy routines. Don Juan laughed and signaled me to sit down by him. The whole situation had mysteriously changed again. My fear had vanished as soon as he had begun to talk. "What are my routines?" I asked. "Everything you do is a routine." "Aren't we all that way?" "Not all of us. I don't do things out of routine." "What prompted all this, Don Juan? What did I do, or what did I say that made you act the way you did?" "You were worrying about lunch." "I didn't say anything to you. How did you know that I was worrying about lunch?" "You worry about eating every day around noontime, and around 6 in the evening, and around 8 in the morning," he said with a malicious grin. "You worry about eating at those times, even if you're not hungry. All I had to do to show your routine spirit was to blow my whistle. Your spirit is trained to work with a signal." He stared at me with a question in his eyes. I couldn't defend myself. "Now you're getting ready to make hunting into a routine," he went on. "You've already set your pace in hunting. You talk at a certain time, eat at a certain time, and fall asleep at a certain time." I had nothing to say. The way Don Juan had described my eating habits was the pattern I used for everything in my life. Yet I strongly felt that my life was less routine than that of most of my friends and acquaintances. "You know a great deal about hunting now," Don Juan continued. "It'll be easy for you to realize that a good hunter knows one thing above all. He knows the routines of his prey. That's what makes him a good hunter. If you would remember the way I've proceeded in teaching you hunting, you would perhaps understand what I mean. First, I taught you how to make and set up your traps. Then I taught you the routines of the game you were after. And then we tested the traps against their routines. Those parts are the outside forms of hunting. Now I have to teach you the final and by far the most difficult part. Perhaps years will pass before you can say that you understand it and that you're a hunter." Don Juan paused, as if to give me time. He took off his hat and imitated the grooming movements of the rodents we'd been observing. It was very funny to me. His round head made him look like one of those rodents. "To be a hunter is not just to trap game," he went on. "A hunter that is worth his salt doesn't catch game because he sets his traps or because he knows the routines of his prey, but because he himself has no routines. This is his advantage. He's not at all like the animals he's after, fixed by heavy routines and predictable quirks. He's free, fluid, unpredictable." What Don Juan was saying sounded to me like an arbitrary and irrational idealization. I couldn't conceive of a life without routines. I wanted to be very honest with him and not just agree or disagree with him. I felt that what he had in mind wasn't possible to accomplish, by me or by anyone. "I don't care how you feel," he said. "In order to be a hunter, you must disrupt the routines of your life. You have done well in hunting. You've learned quickly, and now you can see that you are like your prey. Easy to predict." I asked him to be specific and give me concrete examples. "I am talking about hunting," he said calmly. "Therefore I am concerned with the things animals do, the places they eat, the place, the manner, the time they sleep, where they nest, how they walk. These are the routines I am pointing out to you, so you can become aware of them in your own being. You've observed the habits of animals in the desert. They eat and drink at certain places. They nest at specific spots. They leave their tracks in specific ways. In fact, everything they do can be foreseen or reconstructed by a good hunter. As I told you before, in my eyes, you behave like your prey. Once in my life, someone pointed out the same thing to me, so you're not unique in that." All of us behave like the prey that we're after. That, of course, also makes us prey for something, or someone else. Now, the concern of a hunter who knows all this is to stop being a prey himself. Do you see what I mean? I again expressed the opinion that his proposition was unattainable. "It takes time," Don Juan said. "You could begin by not eating lunch every single day at 12 o'clock. He looked at me and smiled benevolently. His expression was very funny and made me laugh. "There are certain animals, however, that are impossible to track," he went on. "There are certain types of deer, for instance, which a fortunate hunter might be able to come across by sheer luck once in his lifetime." Don Juan paused dramatically and looked at me piercingly. He seemed to be waiting for a question, but I didn't have any. "What do you think makes them so difficult to find and so unique?" he asked. I shrugged my shoulders because I didn't know what to say. "They have no routines," he said in a tone of revelation. "That's what makes them magical." "A deer has to sleep at night," I said. "Isn't that a routine?" "Certainly, if the deer sleeps every night at a specific time and in one specific place. But those magical beings don't behave like that. In fact, someday you may verify this for yourself. Perhaps it'll be your fate to chase one of them for the rest of your life." "What do you mean by that?" "You like hunting? Perhaps someday in some place in the world your path may cross the path of a magical being, and you might go after it. A magical being is a sight to behold. I was fortunate enough to cross paths with one. Our encounter took place after I had learned and practiced a great deal of hunting. Once, I was in a forest of thick trees in the mountains of central Mexico, when suddenly I heard a sweet whistle. It was unknown to me. Never in all my years of roaming in the wilderness had I heard such a sound. I couldn't place it in the terrain. It seemed to come from different places. I thought that perhaps I was surrounded by a herd or a pack of some unknown animals. I heard the tantalizing whistle once more. It seemed to come from everywhere. I realized then my good fortune. I knew it was a magical being, a deer. I also knew that a magical deer is aware of the routines of ordinary men and the routines of hunters. It's very easy to figure out what an average man would do in a situation like that. First of all, his fear would immediately turn him into a prey. Once he becomes a prey, he has two courses of action left. He either flees or he makes his stand. If he's not armed, he would ordinarily flee into the open field to run for his life. If he is armed, he would get his weapon ready and would then make his stand either by freezing on the spot or by dropping to the ground. A hunter, on the other hand, when he stalks in the wilderness, would never walk into any place without figuring out his points of protection. Therefore, he would immediately take cover. He might drop his poncho on the ground, or he might hang it from a branch as a decoy, and then he would hide and wait until the game makes its next move. So, in the presence of the magical deer, I didn't behave like either. I quickly stood on my head and began to wail softly. I actually wept tears and sobbed for such a long time that I was about to faint. Suddenly, I felt a soft breeze. Something was sniffing my hair behind my right ear. I tried to turn my head to see what it was, and I tumbled down and sat up in time to see a radiant creature staring at me. The deer looked at me, and I told him I wouldn't harm him. And the deer talked to me. Don Juan stopped and looked at me. I smiled involuntarily. The idea of a talking deer was quite incredible, to put it mildly. "He talked to me," Don Juan said with a grin. The deer talked? He did. Don Juan stood and picked up his bundle of hunting paraphernalia. Did it really talk? I asked in a tone of perplexity. Don Juan roared with laughter. What did it say? I asked, half in jest. I thought he was pulling my leg. Don Juan was quiet for a moment, as if he were trying to remember. Then his eyes brightened as he told me what the deer had said. The magical deer said, "Hello, friend," Don Juan went on. And I answered, "Hello." Then he asked me, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because I'm sad." Then the magical creature came to my ear and said as clearly as I am speaking now, "Don't be sad." Don Juan stared into my eyes. He had a glint of sheer mischievousness. He began to laugh uproariously. I said that his dialogue with the deer had been sort of dumb. "What did you expect?" he asked, still laughing. "I'm an Indian." His sense of humor was so outlandish that all I could do was laugh with him. "You don't believe that a magical deer talks, do you?" "I'm sorry, but I just can't believe things like that can happen," I said. "I don't blame you," he said reassuringly. "It's one of the darndest things." 9. The Last Battle on Earth. Monday, July 24th, 1961. Around mid-afternoon, after we had roamed for hours in the desert, Don Juan chose a place to rest in a shaded area. As soon as we sat down, he began talking. He said that I had learned a great deal about hunting, but I had not changed as much as he had wished. "It's not enough to know how to make and set up traps," he said. "A hunter must live as a hunter in order to draw the most out of his life. Unfortunately, changes are difficult and happen very slowly. Sometimes it takes years for a man to become convinced of the need to change. It took me years, but maybe I didn't have a knack for hunting. I think for me, the most difficult thing was to really want to change." I assured him that I understood his point. In fact, since he had begun to teach me how to hunt, I also had begun to reassess my actions. Perhaps the most dramatic discovery for me was that I liked Don Juan's ways. I liked Don Juan as a person. There was something solid about his behavior. The way he conducted himself left no doubts about his mastery, and yet he had never exercised his advantage to demand anything from me. His interest in changing my way of life, I felt, was akin to an impersonal suggestion, or perhaps it was akin to an authoritative commentary on my failures. He had made me very aware of my failings, yet I couldn't see how his ways would remedy anything in me. I sincerely believed that in light of what I wanted to do in my life, his ways would have brought me misery and hardship. Hence the impasse. However, I had learned to respect his mastery, which had always been expressed in terms of beauty and precision. "I have decided to shift my tactics," he said. I asked him to explain. His statement was vague, and I wasn't sure whether or not he was referring to me. "A good hunter changes his ways as often as he needs," he replied. "You know that yourself." "What do you have in mind, Don Juan?" "A hunter must not only know about the habits of his prey, he also must know that there are powers on this earth that guide men and animals, and everything that is living." He stopped talking. I waited, but he seemed to have come to the end of what he wanted to say. "What kind of powers are you talking about?" I asked after a long pause. "Powers that guide our lives and our deaths." Don Juan stopped talking, and seemed to be having tremendous difficulty in deciding what to say. He rubbed his hands and shook his head, puffing out his jaws. Twice he signaled me to be quiet as I started to ask him to explain his cryptic statements. "You won't be able to stop yourself easily," he finally said. "I know that you're stubborn, but that doesn't matter. The more stubborn you are, the better it'll be when you finally succeed in changing yourself." "I'm trying my best," I said. "No, I disagree. You're not trying your best. You just said that because it sounds good to you. In fact, you've been saying the same thing about everything you do. You've been trying your best for years, to no avail. Something must be done to remedy that." I felt compelled, as usual, to defend myself. Don Juan seemed to aim, as a rule, at my very weakest points. I remembered then that every time I had attempted to defend myself against his criticisms, I had ended up feeling like a fool, and I stopped myself in the midst of a long explanatory speech. Don Juan examined me with curiosity and laughed. He said in a very kind tone that he had already told me that all of us were fools. I was not an exception. "You always feel compelled to explain your acts as if you are the only man on earth who's wrong," he said. "It's your old feeling of importance. You have too much of it. You also have too much personal history. On the other hand, you don't assume responsibility for your acts. You're not using your death as an advisor. And above all, you're too accessible. In other words, your life is as messy as it was before I met you." Again, I had a genuine surge of pride and wanted to argue that he was wrong. He gestured for me to be quiet. "One must assume responsibility for being in a weird world," he said. "We are in a weird world, you know." I nodded my head affirmatively. "We're not talking about the same thing," he said. "For you, the world is weird because if you're not bored with it, you're at odds with it. For me, the world is weird because it is stupendous, awesome, mysterious, unfathomable. My interest has been to convince you that you must assume responsibility for being here, in this marvelous world, in this marvelous desert, in this marvelous time. I wanted to convince you that you must learn to make every act count, since you're going to be here for only a short while. In fact, too short for witnessing all the marvels of it." I insisted that to be bored with the world, or to be at odds with it, was the human condition. "So, change it," he replied dryly. "If you don't respond to that challenge, you're as good as dead." He dared me to name an issue, an item in my life that had engaged all my thoughts. I said art. I'd always wanted to be an artist, and for years I'd tried my hand at that. I still had the painful memory of my failure. "You have never taken the responsibility for being in this unfathomable world," he said in an indicting tone. "Therefore you were never an artist, and perhaps you'll never be a hunter." "This is my best, Don Juan." "No, you don't know what your best is. I'm doing all I can. You're wrong again. You can do better. There is one simple thing wrong with you. You think you have plenty of time." He paused and looked at me as if waiting for my reaction. "You think you have plenty of time," he repeated. "Plenty of time for what, Don Juan?" "You think your life is going to last forever." "No, I don't." "Then, if you don't think your life is going to last forever, what are you waiting for? Why the hesitation to change?" "Has it ever occurred to you, Don Juan, that I may not want to change?" "Yes, it has occurred to me. I didn't want to change either, just like you. However, I didn't like my life. I was tired of it, just like you. Now, I don't have enough of it. I vehemently asserted that his insistence about changing my way of life was frightening and arbitrary. I said that I really agreed with him at a certain level, but the mere fact that he was always the master that called the shots made the situation untenable for me. "You don't have time for this display, you fool," he said in a severe tone. "This, whatever you're doing now, may be your last act on Earth. It may very well be your last battle. There is no power which could guarantee that you are going to live one more minute." "I know that," I said with contained anger. "No, you don't. If you knew that, you would be a hunter." I contended that I was aware of my impending death, but it was useless to talk or think about it, since I couldn't do anything to avoid it. Don Juan laughed and said I was like a comedian going mechanically through a routine. "If this were your last battle on Earth, I would say that you're an idiot," he said calmly. "You're wasting your last act on Earth in some stupid mood." We were quiet for a moment. My thoughts ran rampant. He was right, of course. "You have no time, my friend, no time. None of us have time," he said. "I agree, Don Juan, but don't just agree with me," he snapped. "You must, instead of agreeing so easily, act upon it. Take the challenge. Change." "Just like that?" "That's right. The change I'm talking about never takes place by degrees. It happens suddenly. And you're not preparing yourself for that sudden act that will bring a total change." I believed he was expressing a contradiction. I explained to him that if I were preparing myself to change, I was certainly changing by degrees. "You haven't changed at all," he said. "That's why you believe you're changing little by little. Yet perhaps you will surprise yourself someday by changing suddenly and without a single warning. I know this is so, and thus I don't lose sight of my interest in convincing you." I couldn't persist in my arguing. I wasn't sure of what I really wanted to say. After a moment's pause, Don Juan went on explaining his point. "Perhaps I should put it in a different way," he said. "What I recommend you to do is to notice that we don't have any assurance that our lives will go on indefinitely. I've just said that change comes suddenly and unexpectedly, and so does death. What do you think we can do about it?" I thought he was asking a rhetorical question, but he made a gesture with his eyebrows, urging me to answer. "To live as happily as possible," I said. "Right. But do you know anyone who lives happily?" My first impulse was to say yes. I thought I could use a number of people I knew as examples. On second thought, however, I knew my effort would only be an empty attempt at exonerating myself. "No," I said. "I really don't." "I do," Don Juan said. "There are some people who are very careful about the nature of their acts. Their happiness is to act with the full knowledge that they don't have time. Therefore, their acts have a peculiar power. Their acts have a sense of—" Don Juan seemed to be at a loss for words. He scratched his temples and smiled. Then, suddenly, he stood up, as if he were through with our conversation. I beseeched him to finish what he was telling me. He sat down and puckered up his lips. "Acts have power," he said, "especially when the person acting knows that those acts are his last battle. There's a strange, consuming happiness in acting with the full knowledge that whatever one is doing may very well be one's last act on Earth. I recommend that you reconsider your life and bring your acts into that light. I disagreed with him. Happiness, for me, was to assume that there was an inherent continuity to my acts, and that I would be able to continue doing, at will, whatever I was doing at the moment, especially if I was enjoying it. I told him that my disagreement was not a banal one, but stemmed from the conviction that the world and myself had a determinable continuity. Don Juan seemed to be amused by my efforts to make sense. He laughed, shook his head, scratched his hair, and finally, when I talked about a determinable continuity, threw his hat to the ground and stomped on it. I ended up laughing at his clowning. "You don't have time, my friend," he said. "That's the misfortune of human beings. None of us have sufficient time, and your continuity has no meaning in this awesome, mysterious world. Your continuity only makes you timid," he said. "Your acts cannot possibly have the flair, the power, the compelling force of the acts performed by a man who knows that he is fighting his last battle on earth. In other words, your continuity doesn't make you happy or powerful." I admitted that I was afraid of thinking I was going to die, and accused him of causing great apprehension in me with his constant talk and concern about death. "But we are all going to die," he said. He pointed toward some hills in the distance. "There is something out there waiting for me, for sure, and I will join it, also, for sure. But perhaps you are different, and death is not waiting for you at all." He laughed at my gesture of despair. "I don't want to think about it, Don Juan." "Why not?" "It's meaningless. If it's out there waiting for me, why should I worry about it?" "I didn't say that you have to worry about it."
What am I supposed to do, then?
Use it.
Focus your attention on the link between you and your death, without remorse or sadness or worrying. Focus your attention on the fact you don't have time, and let your acts flow accordingly. Let each of your acts be your last battle on earth. Only under those conditions will your acts have their rightful power. Otherwise, they'll be, for as long as you live, the acts of a timid man.
Is it so terrible to be a timid man? No, it isn't, if you're going to be immortal. But if you're going to die, there's no time for timidity, simply because timidity makes you cling to something that exists only in your thoughts. It soothes you, while everything is at a lull. But then, the awesome, mysterious world will open its mouth for you, as it will open for every one of us, and then you'll realize that your sure ways were not sure at all. Being timid prevents us from examining and exploiting our lot as men. It's not natural to live with the constant idea of our death, Don Juan. Our death is waiting, and this very act we're performing now may well be our last battle on earth, he replied in a solemn voice. I call it a battle because it is a struggle. Most people move from act to act without any struggle or thought. A hunter, on the contrary, assesses every act, and since he has an intimate knowledge of his death, he proceeds judiciously, as if every act were his last battle. Only a fool would fail to notice the advantage a hunter has over his fellow men. A hunter gives his last battle its due respect. It's only natural that his last act on earth should be the best of himself. It's pleasurable that way. It dulls the edge of his fright. You're right, I conceded. It's just hard to accept. It'll take years for you to convince yourself, and then it'll take years for you to act accordingly. I only hope you have time left." "I get scared when you say that," I said. Don Juan examined me with a serious expression on his face. "I've told you, this is a weird world," he said. "The forces that guide men are unpredictable, awesome, yet their splendor is something to witness." He stopped talking and looked at me again. He seemed to be on the verge of revealing something to me, but he checked himself and smiled. "Is there something that guides us?" I asked. "Certainly. There are powers that guide us." "Can you describe them?" "Not really, except to call them forces, spirits, airs, winds, or anything like that." I wanted to probe him further, but before I could ask anything else, he stood up. I stared at him, flabbergasted. He'd stood up in one single movement. His body simply jerked up, and he was on his feet. I was still pondering upon the unusual skill that would be needed in order to move with such speed when he told me in a dry tone of command to stalk a rabbit, catch it, kill it, skin it, and roast the meat before the twilight. He looked up at the sky and said that I might have enough time. I automatically started off, proceeding the way I had done scores of times. Don Juan walked beside me and followed my movements with a scrutinizing look. I was very calm and moved carefully, and I had no trouble at all in catching a male rabbit. "Now kill it," Don Juan said dryly. I reached into the trap to grab hold of the rabbit. I had it by the ears and was pulling it out when a sudden sensation of terror invaded me. For the first time, since Don Juan had begun to teach me to hunt, it occurred to me that he had never taught me how to kill game. In the scores of times we had roamed in the desert, he himself had only killed 1 rabbit, 2 quail, and 1 rattlesnake. I dropped the rabbit and looked at Don Juan. "I can't kill it," I said. "Why not?" "I've never done that." "But you've killed hundreds of birds and other animals." "With a gun, not with my bare hands." "What difference does it make? This rabbit's time is up." Don Juan's tone shocked me. It was so authoritative, so knowledgeable. It left no doubts in my mind that he knew that the rabbit's time was up. "Kill it," he commanded with a ferocious look in his eyes. "I can't." He yelled at me that the rabbit had to die. He said that its roaming in that beautiful desert had come to an end. I had no business stalling because the power or the spirit that guides rabbits had led that particular one into my trap right at the edge of the twilight. A series of confusing thoughts and feelings overtook me, as if the feelings had been out there waiting for me. I felt with agonizing clarity the rabbit's tragedy to have fallen into my trap. In a matter of seconds, my mind swept across the most crucial moments of my own life, the many times I had been the rabbit myself. I looked at it, and it looked at me. The rabbit had backed up against the side of the cage. It was almost curled up, very quiet and motionless. We exchanged a somber glance, and that glance, which I fancied to be of silent despair, cemented a complete identification on my part. "The hell with it," I said loudly. "I won't kill anything. That rabbit goes free." A profound emotion made me shiver. My arms trembled as I tried to grab the rabbit by the ears. It moved fast, and I missed. I again tried, and fumbled once more. I became desperate. I had the sensation of nausea, and quickly kicked the trap in order to smash it and let the rabbit go free. The cage was unsuspectedly strong, and didn't break as I thought it would. My despair mounted to an unbearable feeling of anguish. Using all my strength, I stomped on the edge of the cage with my right foot. The sticks cracked loudly. I pulled the rabbit out. I had a moment of relief, which was shattered to bits in the next instant. The rabbit hung limp in my hand. It was dead. I didn't know what to do. I became preoccupied with finding out how it had died. I turned to Don Juan. He was staring at me. A feeling of terror sent a chill through my body. I sat down by some rocks. I had a terrible headache. Don Juan put his hand on my head and whispered in my ear that I had to skin the rabbit and roast it before the twilight was over. I felt nauseated. He very patiently talked to me as if he were talking to a child. He said that the powers that guided men or animals had led that particular rabbit to me, in the same way they'll lead me to my own death. He said the rabbit's death had been a gift for me, in exactly the same way my own death will be a gift for something or someone else. I was dizzy. The simple events of that day had crushed me. I tried to think that it was only a rabbit. I couldn't, however, shake off the uncanny identification I had had with it. Don Juan said that I needed to eat some of its meat, if only a morsel, in order to validate my finding. I can't do that, I protested meekly. We are dregs in the hands of those forces, he snapped at me. So stop your self-importance and use this gift properly. I picked up the rabbit. It was warm. Don Juan leaned over and whispered in my ear. Your trap was his last battle on Earth. I told you. He had no more time to roam in this marvelous desert.